Here we can see a range of characteristics that may go in to make up an individual's identity. And in sociology, we talk a lot about gender, social class, and ethnicity, but the other factors are important too. So the sex of a person, their age, whether they have a disability or not, their sexuality, their religion, their nationality are all factors that can go in to make up the identity of that individual. And a useful term for you to use in your essays is the idea of the master status. And Everett Hughes defines the master status as the social position that is the primary identifiable characteristic of an individual. The term master status is defined as a status that has exceptional importance for social identity, often shaping a person's entire life. So in other words, the master status is the most important characteristic that seems to define an individual above everything else. So if we go back to the first slide, let's look at a couple of examples. Let's take disability and someone who is in a wheelchair. Many wheelchair users say that their wheelchair becomes their master status, their most defining characteristic. It is the first thing that people notice about them. They often label them, they often stereotype them, and they can't actually see past the wheelchair itself in terms of that person's identity. And so the disability becomes the master status or the most defining characteristic. If we look at religion, many Muslim women say that if they wear the hijab or the burqa, this becomes their defining characteristic, particularly for others. Other people would judge them or stereotype them based on what they see on that image. So something like religion itself can become the defining characteristic or master status for an individual. So to understand these characteristics a little bit more, we're going to relate them to education and look at 4 different areas. We're going to look at gender, we're going to look at social class, we're going to look at ethnicity, and we're going to look at disability. And as I say, these are all going to be in connection to education. So first, let's have a think about gender. How can the gender of an individual have such an impact in terms of their identity? Well, firstly, in terms of how they're viewed, in terms of how well they're going to do, how they're going to perform in education, and how much effort they put in. Becky Francis, for example, suggested that females often have higher expectations of themselves, but teachers also have higher expectations of the females as well. Conversely, Pinkett and Roberts wrote a book called Boys Don't Try, and they say that often teachers have lower expectations for boys and often label them as being lazy or not liking books or English subjects or languages simply on the fact that they are boys. If we take this one step further, then Carolyn Jackson says that girls are often still sexualized in the classroom and judged on their appearance. So for them, the appearance for their identity is of more importance than it is to boys. Becky Francis also said that boys are more likely to be disciplined and treated with strictness. So a boy, for example, might be told off or shouted more at by a teacher simply by the fact that he is a boy, and perhaps they think that boys can handle that more. So we can see here that the identity of boys and girls is of key importance within the education system. If we move on to social class, then the researcher Basil Bernstein said that language has a key importance in shaping our identity. And Bernstein talked about the elaborated code and the restricted code. The elaborated code is the formal spoken English that features a diverse vocabulary, received pronunciation, that's often known as the Queen's English, void of any slang or street language. Bernstein compared this to the restricted code language, which is the informal spoken English that often features colloquialisms and idiomatic turns of phrase, as well as non-standard grammar and simplistic sentence structure. Now, why did Bernstein say that this is so important to our identity? Well, he said what happens with elaborated code language is we associate that with high intelligence, and it's often used by the middle and upper classes or the higher classes. But for some reason, when we hear well-spoken English, we make the assumption that that person is intelligent. And likewise with restricted code language, it's stereotyped to be of lower intelligence and often used by the lower classes. So someone using slang or street language, there may be an assumption that that person is less intelligent. So our language makes up a key part of our identity. And what about ethnicity? Well, Heidi Mirza looked at Black identity in schools, and she noticed that often when teachers interact with Black students, they fall into one of 3 different categories. She first off talked about the colorblind. And this is where the teacher believed all pupils were equal, but they often missed racism, or they did not challenge it or want to challenge it when they knew that it occurred. Mirza talked about the liberal chauvinists, and this is where the teacher made an association of black pupils being deprived and placing lower expectations on them. So there could, for example, be an assumption that if you're black, particularly living in the UK or America, that you are more likely to live in poverty. In other words, this is a key part of identity. Mirza also then talked about the overt racists, and this is where the teacher saw black pupils as inferior and actively discriminated against them. So we can see that ethnicity is of absolute importance in terms of identity, particularly in schools, and the assumption that other pupils and teachers may make of them. What about disability then? Well, disability in identity is important because it can be heavy in terms of how others view the person with that disability. And it's important to make a distinction between two different types of disabilities. First of all, we have what's called discredited disabilities. And these are ailments which are predominantly visible, such as a person being in a wheelchair. This contrasts with discreditable disabilities, and these are ailments which are largely hidden or often concealable, such as mental illness. The reason why it's so important to make this distinction is because discredited disabilities seem to have a big impact on how others view that person. And actually, the researcher Len Barton suggests that those with disabilities face continual exclusion at school and wider society, particularly if it's predominantly visible, such as a person being in a wheelchair. And so disability can often, as we mentioned at the start, become the master status for the person that does actually have the ailment.